Hi, friends. Welcome back to Extraordinary Connections. My name is Dillon Burns. I'm the pastor at Manchester United Methodist Church and glad to be with you for another of our daily devotionals. And today, I'd like to reflect on those moments when we try to make Scripture say the things that we want it to say, as opposed to what God might want it to say. This past week, I was preparing a sermon on Jonah. Throughout a course of weeks, I'm preaching through the book of Jonah, which incidentally is a wonderful one and only 4 chapters long. So if you haven't read it or read it in a while, I recommend it. Pull it out there from the middle of the minor prophets. Take a few minutes to read it. It is funny and insightful. I'm having a great time preaching through it. But with that said, I was working on the sermon about Jonah and having the darndest time finding a story or illustration of some sort to draw out Jonah's story in my preaching. And so I was doing what I sometimes do as part of my creative process, which is flail about imaginatively. Any sort of half idea I come up with, I run down to see where it leads me. And eventually I found one that seemed like it might have some prospect. It was essentially an illustration based around the various ways in the world of computer science that you can go about sorting data. Oftentimes, you'll run into a situation where you're given data that is unsorted, needs to be put in a particular order, say alphabetical order, and there's about 1,000 different ways, at least it seems to me, that you can go about doing that. You can pull out each bit of data one at a time and put it in order. You can take them in chunks. You can do a whole number of other things. And so I was getting deeper and deeper into this whole of researching this, getting excited, thinking this is really phenomenal. I'm enjoying this. I can bring this into a sermon and convince other people that it's interesting too. And then I got to the end of this little exploration and deep dive, and I turned back around and I looked at the book of Jonah and realized the illustration I was holding no longer had anything to do with the book of Jonah and what I understood the book of Jonah to say. I was holding an illustration in search of a scripture to go with it, as opposed to the place that I would like to be, which is holding a scripture and in search of an illustration. I was at a moment where I could have worked on taking the illustration and forming the scripture to fit it instead of the other way around. And this is a dangerous place to be, and one worth reflecting on, because it's my experience that we can get there a lot easier than we would like. Earlier in the course of this year, when we were deep in the thick of worrying about COVID-19, which is not to say we're not still, but it was back when it was still relatively new and we were all sort of flailing about to figure out what churches and all of the rest of life should be doing differently because of the coronavirus. There was a scripture that came into the forefront of my mind that popped up in conversation and used to justify not making any changes to what we were doing. Here's the scripture I'm talking about. This is Psalm 91, and sort of the whole psalm speaks to this, but I'm pulling specifically here verses 9 through 12. Let's read them together. Because you've made the Lord my refuge, the Most High, your place of residence, no evil will happen to you. No disease will come close to your tent, because he will order his messengers to help you, to protect you wherever you go. They will carry you with your own hands, so you don't bruise your foot on a stone. You can see how someone might take this passage, I might want to take this passage and say, look, we can do what we want to do because God will protect us from evil, disease, from falls. We can go wherever we want to go, and God will send angels to pick us up so we don't even bruise our feet on the stones on the ground. This is appealing, and in fact, not all that drawn out from the words on the page. It seems like it could be exactly the meaning of Psalm 91. But I would propose that it is in fact what we want Psalm 91 to say, and not what God might have it say. And I say this in particular because this scripture, and particularly the verses here, are quoted one other time in Scripture, and not by the person you'd like to have Scripture quoted by. Here we've got Luke chapter 4. This is verses 9 through 11. Jesus is in the desert being tempted by the devil before entering into his ministry. And we pick it up in verse 9. The devil brought him into Jerusalem, him being Jesus, stood him at the highest point of the temple. He said to him, "Since you are God's son, throw yourself down from here, for it's written, He will command His angels concerning you to protect you, and they will take you up in their hands so that you won't hit your foot on a stone." This draws into question the meaning of Psalm 91. For all of a sudden, the devil is quoting this scripture to say you can do what you want to do, and surely God has to protect you. That's what Psalm 91 means. And though I don't have it here on the screen, you might remember Jesus rebukes this affront, this interpretation of scripture, and says, hey, it's written elsewhere in scripture, do not test the Lord your God. This puts Psalm 91 in slightly a different light. Perhaps we shouldn't do whatever we want to do and expect God to protect us. Perhaps it has more to do with God being with us wherever we go, with God protecting us in the places that we are called to go, and trusting that in those moments when we are injured or in pain, sick or ill at ease, God is with us and healing and comfort will come in time. That's a different interpretation. And I suspect many of us, myself included, would come to that interpretation were we not in the midst of wishing for Scripture to say what we want it to say. So, how do we avoid moments like this? Well, this is one, to take Scripture and put it in conversation with other Scripture. At any point that we're reading the text, we should ask how it relates to the other parts of the text that we have read and remember. How is the text in conversation with itself in ways that it might temper its own interpretation or encourage a particular take versus another? The second is to put Scripture in context, so not just to flail about and find every other Scripture, but to say Psalm 91 verses X through Y are next to these other verses, and in a larger context, in a larger narrative, how does it fit there, and what does the context around it say about it? We might also ask, what do other people say about this text? How would they interpret it? And if nobody else is pulling out what we think should be pulled out, perhaps there is a reason for that. And that leads into the final and most important method for not drawing our own meaning out of Scripture, but unearthing what God might say, which is to hold all of our interpretations with humility. Friends, we are, I hope, always growing in our faith, our understanding of who God is and who we are, and how Scripture speaks to that. And so it is good to go searching for what the text says and what it means, and it is good to revise it regularly, to allow our understanding to grow, to let the old pass away for the new, and when the new becomes old, to repeat the process, to hold our interpretations with humility. It's not an easy task by any means, but an important one, and a lifelong journey. Friends, may we seek out what God would say to us, rather than put words in God's mouth that we wish God would say. Read Scripture, enjoy it, and grow in your understanding. And friends, go in peace.